it shouldn't take too super long. I am going to be using the, it's environmental fog, so I will be using this environmentalfog.ma if anyone's following along. So I'm going to grab that. Don't save that, please. And I have a few pre-rendered renders of, oh god, I'm just going to close all this really quick. In that Mash Play Images folder, where I sort of show you like what I'm going to show you before we actually do it. So there's basically three types of, well, there's two types of environmental fog, and this is at least in Arnold. Redshift has a similar thing, and I have absolutely no idea whether Unity has their own comparable thing. This is mostly just like for Arnold demo right now. Again, I don't know how well this would transfer into Unity, if at all. So this is like a gross little room that I've made. Pretty much it's just a closed-in box. The only holes you see are on the side here. I have a single area light shining down into the room. So this is what it looks like without any kind of fog. This is what it looks like with the first type of fog. This is just called an AI fog. It's not affected by lighting at all, so if you like shine a light through this, it's not going to affect the fog at all. It just pretty much always looks the same. It's going to be interesting for doing sort of distance effects like this if you're looking into a foggy woods or like in the ocean. Or, you know, you can actually switch the position and kind of make it look like swamp fog if you want. The other type of fog is, it's like environmental volume or something weird. I forget exactly what it's called, but pretty much really similar setup. The only difference here is that light does affect this one. So the difference is pretty subtle. I made the fog a little bit bluish, so again, here's the no fog and with fog. With the fog, you can see that the area right around that little beam of light is a little bit softer. Basically what's happening is the light is going into that beam of, or going into that fog and sort of bouncing around and feathering that edge a little bit. But it's really nice for making stuff like, another example of this type of fog that's a little bit more obvious is something like this. So here's, again, no fog, and with the environmental volume fog, you can get, use it for effects like God rays and stuff like this, where you can see like on the pier, there's little areas like this that are like shining down, a little brighter, that kind of thing. So I really like using this kind of stuff for if you're ever making like an old space that's supposed to be really dusty or kind of abandoned. And you ever, you know, look through the window, it's crazy bright out, and you see those like, oh, look, it's like old and dusty, and it creates like this weird homely effect or whatever. I don't know. Basically, you can use this to make a lot of extra additional interest in your scene without doing anything to the models at all. So how to actually set this up. Again, this is just the environmental fog MA file, and I have absolutely no idea. Okay, so again, here's my scene. Literally nothing interesting happening here. It's pretty ugly. This is no fog at all. If you want to turn on fog, go into, and this is for Arnold, go into your render settings, Arnold tab, same place you would look for sampling. If you scroll down, there is a tab called Environment. Click it. What you're going to be working with is the Atmosphere tab. Basically, you can just click on this little button. It's going to ask, do you want to... these are two that I was fiddling with in here already. But you can create AI fog. So AI fog is the one that is not affected by light at all. Atmospheric volume is the one that is affected by light and will have nice God rays. So I'm just going to click Create AI Fog, and you can see that it makes whatever this is. I'll show you how to edit that in like 2 seconds. Just for the record, if you guys ever see something in Maya where it's like, you know, whatever name, parentheses legacy, basically what that means is in a version or two of Maya that is going to be gone. It's just like the old algorithm for calculating something. So if you've ever done UVing, they have a legacy option for the unfold tool right now. I'm not really going to go over this a lot. It's, in case you need to use it, pretty much is the same thing as like a sphere. It's like making a dome light with a sphere and a surface shader. It doesn't light your scene, it just provides a background, but this is literally all that does. So they're getting rid of this. Again, not super going over that. So once you put in your little AI fog into your atmosphere, again, you can see that it shows up here. If you're so inclined, you can change the color and turn this into like gross swamp fog, which I like the idea of. So we have gross green swamp fog. The next thing that I usually end up looking at is which direction is this fog facing. And that is, I think of ground, all right. So ground normal is usually how I sort of interpret the positioning of this fog. So right now it's set to, on the X, Y, and Z axis, we have Z is set to 1, X and Y are both 0. So if I look at my camera, I can see I'm pretty much rendering straight along my Z axis, and the fog is pretty much showing up straight down my Z axis. If I set, Y to 0.5, you can see that it kind of slants the fog in a strange direction. But I can set Z to 0, and now the fog is on the ground instead of being in the background. So you can fiddle with these. Again, this pretty much just changes the direction of the fog. These are also values that you can key if you're so inclined. So if you want ground fog, I'm just going to right-click on the Y attribute of ground normal and Z, go to like frame 35, set this to 0 and this to 1 or 2 apparently. Do key selected and key selected. So now if I scrub between these, you can see that the fog will actually just actively move and slant upwards. Again, I'm not really sure why you'd want that, but I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm just going to right-click on this and do break connection. That'll get rid of any keyframes on that attribute, so I don't need to worry about it moving around. Any questions on this so far? All right. So ground point, I'll think of as pretty much the 0 point, I guess, like 0 value of that. So like if you set an object to 0, 0, 0, it's going to snap it to the center of your grid, where 0 is, not a positive or negative number. It's like directly in the center of the y-axis. That's pretty much what this is. It's just like allowing you to set the ground point of your object, of your fog. So right now it's showing up on the y-axis, so I'm going to see what happens if I set ground point to 50. It does really questionable things. All right, so 20. If I set ground point to 20, you can kind of see that the fog has like moved up in the scene. It's become thicker towards the top, thicker on the bottom and then kind of like feathers off towards the top a little bit. If you wanted to, you could play with height. So if you set that to a lower value, you can see that it pretty much stops like very abruptly, or not very abruptly, but like it's like much less pronounced farther away from this fog layer that you've set. If I set ground point to like -10, it doesn't really show up in the scene. I think I actually have my floor on 0, 0, 0. So you can actually see the fog just like hanging out here past the window. It's just not showing up in my scene because it's not tall enough and the ground point is far enough below my floor that it's just not showing up. If I set my height, oh god, back to something like 6.024, you can see that it starts to show up in the floor again. It's just like a little bit less aggressive. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to 0 and play a little bit with the sort of height and stuff like that. So again, height is pretty much how far is this fog rising. I feel like that one's fairly self-explanatory. If you set it to 0, it just explodes your entire screen, which is appealing or something. And then distance, I usually end up not playing super a lot with this because it seems like every time I do, it like shoots my fog off in some weird direction. Where like I went from 0.02 to 0.1 and it like exploded the fog throughout my scene. So you can play with it for different effects. I guess I find like usually I end up entering really tiny numbers into that one. But yeah, that's more or less fog. That's more or less this type of fog. So again, this isn't really affecting the light at all. It is just really nice for if you do need sort of ground swampiness. The other thing that you can do if you're so inclined is map in like a noise texture into height. And I think you can actually use a 3D noise texture. In this case, I'm just going to use regular. But you can see that as I've done that, it's pretty much clamped the values of height between 0 and 1. But it does make kind of an interesting little effect down here where it's sort of like feathered and it looks maybe a little bit more like wispy misty. So that's something you can play with if you need to. Other thing is if you ever click out of your fog and you're like, where is it in my attribute editor? Usually I'll just go back into my render settings and just click through on this little click through box. It'll pull up your settings for that fog again. I'm actually now curious what happens if I set this to a value of like 2. Okay, that's kind of fun. So if you set height to, if you use like a noise map for height, you can use this to sort of the distance to kind of control the fog. It'll like stretch a little bit more, I guess. Pull it up a little bit higher. Anyway, that's pretty much this type of fog. Any questions about this one? All right, cool. I'm gonna nip over into the other scene that I've set up because I find that one is more obvious with the environmental fog. So I'm gonna open up environmental fog pier where I have spelled pier incorrectly. So here's my scene. Pretty much just has a single random area light that's like super tiny hanging out up here. And I have this like weird water plane here. Pretty much all that is I used a texture deformer and a noise map to make this lumpy, and it kind of sort of looks like water-ish. Kind of. So again, this is what it looks like with that fog. You apply it in the same exact way that you would the other one. So I'm just going to go into my render settings, under the Arnold tab, under environment, and you can see here that I have this little volume already mapped in. So I'm just going to right-click on this and do break connection. And I'm going to just do create a new AI atmosphere volume. By default, this one doesn't really show up looking like anything. You need to actually set the density up for it to show up. And you can see that as soon as I do that, it does kind of make an interesting effect. In this case, it's super, super blown out and pretty hard to look at. If I wanted to, I could set the color of the fog, perhaps this awkward periwinkle color. That's, what the heck. All right, so I'm just going to set my density really high. And again, you can see that this one is actually being affected by the light. You see these light rays here. So if you are looking to create the sort of God ray effect, you would need to use this type of fog. If you're looking to just sort of fudge that effect on a specific render angle in something like Unity, you can totally make God ray cards and just like put them by your window. As long as they're not moving around in the scene, like they actually usually end up reading pretty well. They do just, again, hold up better from a pretty specific render angle. So density is, again, pretty much how much fog there is. You can see a little bit, like the higher I set this, at some point it'll pretty much obscure most of my scene. Basically what's happening right now is the light is hitting this fog and bouncing around in it super aggressively, which is why the entire scene becomes fairly overexposed. If you ever need to counteract that, you can use this attenuation slider. So I kind of think about this, if you've ever seen, like this is a good effect for like a really sort of murky water, where you have this really, really bright hot light here. Attenuation is basically just controlling how far the light will penetrate the fog before stopping. So what was before a super blown out scene, you can see that now it's not even super blown out here, but it's like brightest here right around the light, and then the fall off of that light is significantly less the farther you get from that light. Does that make sense? Cool. In this case, I'm going to set this to something maybe slightly less aggressive for density. And then I find playing, so anisotropy is, you can also, if you want, set attenuation color. It usually reacts somewhat oddly to the color density, but you can do it if you want. And then anisotropy, I find, usually I just sort of end up fiddling with this. It's kind of like how the light, honestly don't really know how to describe this super well. It's kind of just like how the light moves through the fog to an extent. So I find that lowering it usually kind of can potentially create the effect where, like, intensify the God ray effect, more or less by sort of like, if you look right like in here, so this area here where the fog is kind of shadowed, sometimes if you drop anisotropy, it'll sort of make that shadow a little bit darker and less foggy looking, whereas the highlight from this light shadow will remain stronger. So I kind of use this as a way to either intensify or lessen the God rays. So I mean here, it's pretty much just like no God rays because everything's washed out. The light is just bouncing around everywhere. But again, kind of just like fiddle with that to get the effect that you need overall. But that's really all there is to that particular type of fog. If you shift the light around, I'm just going to move this in a completely arbitrary fashion. You can see, scroll out, that the God rays are actually changing their position. So you can do an interesting thing where you're like, it's morning and now it's night, or something like that. And that lighting would change, again, according to where the position of the light is. There's like 2 more things I want to go over with this, and then we'll break for just sort of open lab for the rest of class. But first thing is, well, I guess they both tie together, but basically if you're ever looking to adjust the samples of your fog, for this type of fog, there's like 3 places to do it. So one is, if I've ever, been like, oh, that one shadow is really grainy, look in your light samples. Each light also does have samples that are dedicated to volumetric renders. So, and it's not this normal sample slider that we would use to adjust the shadow for this light. If you scroll down, there is a separate volume samples slider here. So this is for rendering volumes like fog. It's not going to affect your standard polygon objects. The slider for your standard polygon object samples are not going to affect this. So if you can try this if you're having issues with sampling. So I'm going to set this up to like 10 to see if it does anything. In this case, this one doesn't really seem to be causing any issues. So I'm just going to set this back down. Setting it down to 0 just gets rid of the fog entirely. Even setting it to 1 for this particular one doesn't really seem to affect the render that much. So I'm just going to leave it at 1. Just be aware, so if you want to, you can pretty much, I don't know why you would, but you can basically turn this fog into an AI fog. If you, for my light, uncheck cast volumetric shadows, that way this light is not going to affect this fog at all. And this particular render, I am actually kind of a fan of just pure aesthetic value. It looks like an interesting video game aesthetic that you might want for some reason. Alright. But again, this pretty much turns it into a like AI fog. So if you want those God rays, you do need to leave cast volumetric shadows turned on. It's on by default, but leave it on. Other place you can go to test out your render settings is your render, just like master render settings. Under the sampling where you normally adjust stuff for like diffuse, transmission, etc., they have this little volume indirect slider, which, holy crap, I've set to 40 like a crazy person. But this is also one place that you can try to affect the sampling. Whoa, what? Where you can try and, what have you done? What did I do? That was weird. Hang on. I'm actually unclear what I clicked there. What? I've done something strange. 5 seconds. What the? Well, that's super irritating. Alright, just gonna reopen the scene. Not entirely sure what I did there. Alright, cool. So we have hopefully now a functional, yes, lovely, functional render. So other place you can edit the settings for this is again, just this volume indirect under your normal sampling tab. Sometimes this helps, sometimes it doesn't. Usually you should not need to set it up to 40. In this case, it actually doesn't seem to be doing anything completely horrifying to the render time, so eh. But the other place that I found to be more helpful for editing the samples most of the time in the scenes that I've done is under the atmosphere itself. So if you just, again, click into the settings for that, attribute editor, there is a separate sample slider, again, specifically for that volume that you are rendering. So if I like start the render here, I'm going to set this up to something obnoxious like 15. And you can see that maybe you can see it on the projector, but this is like way smoother looking. What if I do 30? Like being super aggressive. So if I set that up, the whole thing gets a lot smoother, especially in the shadows. Like up here, it usually tends to not be as much of an issue. So if I set this to 1, it looks like pretty dang trashy. So this is like one sample for that fog, and again, you can see under here it looks really gross. So most of the time I will just edit sort of this slider for the fog. That's pretty much environmental fog. I do find this works better in like real world scale than it does like the super tiny scenes I tend to make. But are there any questions about why you'd want to use this or how to use this? Cool. All right. So I think that